the book's original title, and I have Peter to thank for the fact that it's not called that anymore, was The Libertarian Welfare State. And that, first of all, would have killed any sales in Europe, since there aren't very many libertarians in Europe. But there is a hard right in Europe, and it's gaining influence, and I think they're saying many of the same things that our right is saying. And it was really mainly the agitation I was increasingly feeling at listening to the inanity of the political dialogue, the slogans that were being shouted about as if they had some relation to events in the world, that got me out of my chair and in front of the keyboard to start writing. I liked the Librarian of Congress who said that he got up at 5 in the morning and wrote for 2 hours to discover what he thinks. I thought, what a great concept. And it's been true for me. Every time I've begun a writing project, I've had sort of an idea where I hoped it would go, but it never ended up going quite where I thought it was going to go. And I've always learned an incredible amount in the process of doing it. And I remember Dick Thaler telling me before I wrote my first book, you're not ready to write a book. You haven't really got it together yet. So I think you need to gather your thoughts together for another couple of years. But I started, and wow, it was such fun to figure out what I needed to know. There was no way nearly as efficient as that I could imagine to figure out what things I knew and what things I didn't know. And so I think for me, that's always been the model. Just if you can get the motivation to sit in front of the keyboard, get started, and then you'll figure out what you need to do. So our inane dialogue is different from your inane dialogue in lots of particulars. Every country's got its own inane dialogue, I guess is the rule. But it's caused enormous harm for us in the US. There are steps we can't take or even talk about because they're just politically unthinkable. You're seeing a lot of this in Europe too with the austerity movement. What we know about economies in deep downturns after financial crises is that they don't right themselves spontaneously. When I studied macro, national income was equal to C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government spending. The consumers don't spend in the wake of a big meltdown because they've either lost their jobs or worried they're going to lose them. They've got debts to pay off. They're not going to lead us out of the downturn. Businesses have no reason whatsoever to invest. They've got plenty of plant and equipment to produce more than people want to buy now. Why build more? So no C, no I, that leaves G. And it was Keynes who I think laid out the theory for the first time in a clear way that if you don't have the one actor on the scene who could make a difference step in and spend at a very high level, you're going to languish at low levels of output for a long, long time. And in the US, Roosevelt seemed to have an intuitive grasp that you needed to get the government in there spending money and doing projects, but even the scale at which he did it was not enough to really bridge the demand shortfall. It wasn't until World War II that it really became a self-sustaining recovery. They say we've got to do something about the deficit. I'm a deficit hawk too. You got to do something about the deficit. But now, during a downturn, that's exactly the wrong thing to be worried about. Cutting spending during a downturn is going to make the deficit worse. We should be seizing the opportunities to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. We've got roads and bridges and water systems and sewage systems and dams that are collapsing all around. We've got people unemployed who know how to do the work to fix them. We've got interest rates, 10-year Treasury bills, 1.7%. The money's cheap, the materials are cheap, the workers are idle. It's not like you don't have to fix the interstate highways that are crumbling. There's one estimate I like to quote from Nevada. They've got a 10-mile stretch of main interstate highway that's badly worn. They estimate you can fix it now for $6 million. And if you wait 2 years, the frost will heave the roadbed up. The truck traffic will degrade it further. You'll have to dig deeper and replace more of it. It'll cost you $30 million if you wait 2 years. So fix it now for $6 million. Fix it in 2 years for $30 million. There's no issue that we're going to let Route 80 go back to gravel. That's not one of the options. And yet we've got politicians saying we can't have any more government spending. The 6 Republicans who are appointed to the super committee, the new congressional committee charged with balancing the budget, have each signed a pledge that they will never under any circumstances approve any revenue increases. And here we've got a budget to balance, and they're going to do it what? With spending cuts alone, by not fixing the interstates? They say we can't impoverish our grandchildren. Well, if you fix the interstate now, you're going to have richer grandchildren than if you wait 2 years to fix the interstate. It's just nonsense. All taxation is theft, they shout. It's social engineering when you impose congestion fees. There are all these things that sort of dominate the discourse. I don't think it's as bad in Europe, but I think you're pointed in that same direction. The austerity movement's got lots of very influential supporters here, and you're doing the wrong thing, basically. The Cameron government's doing the wrong thing in terms of dealing with the downturn. Anyway, that's what got me out of my reverie and onto the keyboard, was just a sense of agitation about all that. And I don't know how many new ideas there are in the book. There were things I discovered in the process of writing it, but I think the main thing for me that emerged in the process of writing it was a clearer way to frame the broad issues that the book's concerned with. I made a bold prediction, one that I won't be around to see not come true. In 100 years' time, if you poll professional economists, a majority of them will say that Darwin was the founder of the discipline. Of course, today, everyone would say Adam Smith. I think that will, in fact, happen, and for good reason. And it's not at all because I have any lack of admiration for Adam Smith's ideas. I'm a huge admirer of Smith's. He's got many modern disciples who I think have a wrong conception of what he said in The Wealth of Nations. He did not say that all you need to do is turn greedy, selfish people loose in unfettered markets and you'll get the best of all possible worlds. He didn't say that. What he did say was that if you turn greedy, selfish people loose in the marketplace, you'll often get very good results in many domains. And that was by itself a remarkable insight. Where was Aristotle? He didn't notice that. All these smart people who had written before Smith never put that story together. I think everybody knew that the entrepreneur would introduce a cost-saving innovation if he could, because that would let him steal business from his rivals. What no one managed to get down clearly was the dynamic that would set loose. So the rivals, of course, aren't happy that the cost-saving innovation caused them to lose business. They rush to copy it, they imitate as best they can, and it spreads like wildfire. And when the dust settles, the resulting competition drives price down to the new lower level of cost made possible by the innovation. And it's not the firms that benefit in the end from all that churning, it's the consumers. They get better products at lower prices. That's the invisible hand story. And I think if you don't marvel at it, you don't understand it. I think we send too many students out in the world who don't understand how remarkable that story is. And I don't want to be associated with any movement that belittles the importance of that idea. I think it's a fabulously important idea. But where I think Darwin had a better vision of things was he had an understanding of the competitive process that I think it would be fair to say encompasses Smith's invisible hand narrative as an interesting special case. But the real narrative is a much more general one. So if you think about traits that are favored by natural selection, Darwin's point was that they're favored in almost all cases because they help the individual animals survive and reproduce. They contribute to individual reproductive fitness. And often, traits that do that play out in exactly analogous ways to the invisible hand story. So if you think about the familiar account of keen eyesight in the hawk, if there were a phone book with 6-point type columns of numbers on the back wall and I were a hawk, I could read you off those numbers. They have incredible resolving power in their vision. That got to be that way because seeing a little bit better than your rival made you catch more mice when you're cruising above the valley floor. You'd spot your prey more effectively. There was some mutation that molded the cornea slightly differently and made them see a little bit better. That animal had an advantage. It left more offspring. The mutation spread rapidly as its offspring carried it out into the field. And then there was another mutation, so there was an accretion of mutations. They don't see 10 miles distant. There was an equilibrium there, but it was an incredibly acute visual process that got crafted by all that, and it helped the hawk who first had the mutation, but it ended up not giving individual hawks who see well a competitive advantage vis-a-vis one another. They all see well now. You're not a player if you're a hawk and you don't see well. What it did do was make hawks as a group quite better off in their efforts to extract a living from nature. So a trait was selected that was good for the individual, also good for the group, no conflict, exactly like the invisible hand account. But then Darwin saw other examples where the trait that was in the individual's interest and would be favored by natural selection worked against the interests of the group. So think, for example, of the signature example in the book is the one that's on the cover illustration, the massive antlers of the modern bull elk. They're 4 feet across, they weigh 40 pounds, they're a horrible encumbrance when the animal's chased into a wooded area by wolves. He's easily surrounded and killed and eaten. You don't want to have big antlers like that if your project is getting away from wolves who are trying to eat you. They're a handicap. Well, why are they so big then? I was crestfallen. I saw a review of my book in Slate a couple of weeks ago. Some guy, John Whitfield, I don't know if anybody knows him, he's from the UK. I'd never heard of him, a science writer. I thought, well, at least he'll understand the science. So he says, "What the Darwin economy gets wrong about evolution." That's his subtitle of his review. And I said, oh my God, did we miss something? I had my biologist friends read it. They didn't tell me they saw any problem. Did I make some mistake I wasn't aware of? So I read through his review, and I was relieved at first to see that he didn't understand the process I was describing, but relief gave way quickly to annoyance. Now the people who see that review are going to think the book got it wrong. I didn't get. Here's the story. If you're a bull elk, like males in virtually all vertebrate species, you try to take more than one mate if you can. That's what most vertebrate males do across species. Their investment in the reproductive process is minimal. They contribute genes that the females find attractive, and so it's a contest between the males to see who can get access to females. And so, of course, if you're successful at that, if you take multiple mates, the other side of that coin is that some males are frozen out. They get no mates at all, and that's the ultimate loser slot in the Darwinian scheme. So yes, they're going to fight tooth and nail to get access to female. They'll take any step they can, and the antlers for the elk happen to be the weaponry that was decisive in many of the battles. If you had a mutation that coded for slightly bigger ones, that animal would win more of his fights and leave copies of those antlers. And so you saw the arms race, they got bigger and bigger. So Whitfield says if big antlers were a problem, natural selection would just weed them out. That's a total misunderstanding of the dynamic. The antlers we see in the surviving animals are not 40 feet across. They're not 60 feet across. There is an equilibrium in that process, but is it the right size for bull elk as a group? The answer is no. If they were 40 feet across, then before the animal got to be 4 or 5 months old, it couldn't get its head up off the turf. It wouldn't be able to fight or mate or do anything useful. Yes, natural selection would weed a mutation that coded for 40-foot antlers out in a heartbeat. But the process was gradual. They got bigger and bigger, and it gradually stabilized when the handicap from having bigger antlers was enough to outweigh the advantage from being able to beat your fellow males in fights for access to females. That's inefficient in exactly the same way as when everybody stands up to see better, nobody sees better than before. You don't climb to the roof to see better, you stand up to see better. Although sometimes in events I've been to, people climb up onto their chair to see better, and then you got the whole auditorium taking one more step. But there's an equilibrium in those processes. It's just inefficient from the perspective of the group. And My claim is that if you're a modern disciple of Adam Smith and you say the invisible hand is the metaphor that should guide policy, get the government out of the way, let markets work their magic, no, there's no presumption that competition will produce efficient results in general, particularly when it's competition against your own kind. The peacock's tail, the antlers in the bull elk, the massive body size of the bull elephant seal. All of these are examples of traits that were selected for competition against your own kind, and those typically end up being inefficient from the point of view of males as a group in many cases, sometimes even from the perspective of the whole species. Cheating is selected in many species. Cheating's not good for the group, it's good for the individual. So there's no presumption that competition steers behavior in ways that give you the biggest advantage for society as a whole. That's something you need to examine. In some cases it will, in some cases it won't. And I think this has enormously important implications for tax policy. So if you think about the developments in the last 30 years in the US and to a lesser degree, but the same pattern in Europe, what's happened is that the old pattern of steady income growth, in the US it was 3% a year, rich, middle, and low income households saw their incomes growing at a nice steady rate for 3 decades after World War II. Since then, it's been all the income growth has been concentrated at the top. People at the top are spending more. That's not a moral indictment of them, obviously. That's what everybody does when they get more money. They build bigger houses. They stage more elaborate parties. In the process, though, they shift the frame of reference that governs what others spend, not because people are jealous necessarily, just because that's the way context shapes demand. How big a house do I need? I lived in Nepal for 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer. I lived in a 2-room house with a grass roof that leaked, no plumbing, no electricity. If you lived in a house like that here, you'd be ashamed of it. Your kids wouldn't want their friends to know where you lived. I never felt that way. I was proud to entertain in that house when I was in Nepal because it was actually the nicest house that any of the teachers in my school lived in. I never experienced it as a crummy house, but here it would be a different matter. If my Nepali friends saw my house in Ithaca, they would think I'd taken total leave of my senses. Why would anybody need a house like that? They would wonder. But you wouldn't think that if you saw my house. Of course, context shapes demands. Is a car fast? That depends. How fast are cars out there? At one time, if your car got up to 60 miles an hour, eventually it would have seemed fast. But now it's got to get there in 3.5 seconds, or else people say, can't we put a blower on this thing? Or, Context matters, so when the rich build bigger, the near rich, they travel in the same circles, they build bigger too. Then there's a group that rubs elbows with them, one notch below. There's an expenditure cascade. So in the US, in housing, this is the big ticket item, the median new house built in 2007 was 2,300 square feet. In 1980, it had been 1,600 square feet. The median family didn't earn any more in real terms in 2007 than it did in 1980. Why was it spending so much more on a house? The answer was because others were spending more on houses. And the cascade trickled down. Well, you could say, pull yourself together. If you can't afford the house, don't buy it. That would be, I think, a perfectly adequate response, except for one thing. Every parent I know has the goal of wanting to send his or her kids to the best school possible. If you were the median parent in the earnings distribution and you didn't want to send your kid to a school that ranked in at least the 50th percentile in the school quality distribution, most people would think ill of you. What kind of parent is it that doesn't have an ambition to at least send his kids to an average school? But then look at the choice that confronts the median parent with. If I want to send my kid to the 50th percentile school, I got to buy a 2,300 square foot house now, and I don't have any more money than before. Well, the banks made money available to me. They let me buy with no down payment. So others were buying with no down payment. If I don't, then it's my kids who'll go to the schools where the other kids score in the 20th percentile in reading and math, or there are metal detectors out front. Parents aren't going to do that. That's not the choice most parents make. When they all decide to go for the house in the better school district and they borrow more and they go into debt, or they take a second job or work longer hours, They succeed only in bidding up the prices of the houses in the better school district. 50% of all kids go to bottom half schools, the same as before. In safety, the conservatives have a bulletproof rhetorical drill they do. Why should the government regulate safety? Here you have a worker who says, I'm willing to accept the risk that the employer's asking me to accept because he's going to pay me extra to do it. And the employer says, well, I'm going to save money by not having to put all the safety equipment in, so I can pay you a higher salary. And they're both happy with the deal. And the conservatives will say, where does the government presume to stand between those two consenting adults and say, you can't do the contract you want to do? And I would agree with that if it could be shown that the contract had no adverse effects on anyone else, then whose business would it be to get in their way? I don't think it would be good enough to say, well, the worker doesn't understand his own interests. Well, then educate him. Do something else besides make him behave in a way that it doesn't want to. But there is an externality here. If I sell my safety, I can get a higher wage. That's the standard trade-off that exists in the labor market. I can take that higher wage and bid for a house in a better school district. That works. That's all I need to get into a better school district is more money. If I were the only one who did it, I'd be home free. But I'm not the only one who's going to do it. If I do it, others will do it. And when we all do it, all we succeed in doing is bidding up the prices of the houses in the better school districts. So there too, it's not at all incoherent to say, would rational individuals have any reason to approve of a collective action that limits the amount of risk they can take in the workplace? Every society on earth does that. And in every society on earth, conservatives complain that the government has no right. But why isn't there a government that doesn't do that if the government not doing that is such a great thing? Where can the people who insist the government shouldn't be doing that move to? There isn't a society that doesn't do that, and there's a reason that societies do that. If we're going to argue about safety regulation, we ought to argue about how to do it. Should we tax injuries? Should we have more heavily experience-rated workman's compensation insurance? There are lots of ways you could conceivably try to improve safety levels in the workplace. Maybe some of the regulations that we impose in that domain are ham-fisted and do more harm than good. That's the conversation I'd like to see people having, other than this principled insistence that the government has no business being here. So, have I used up all my time? I'll describe the punchline tax proposal is rather than tax useful activities the way we do now, we should just scrap every tax on a useful activity. That would include the payroll tax, which makes it more expensive to add jobs, the tax on income, which includes a tax on savings, which is definitely not something we want to discourage. Taxes discourage activities and they raise revenue. We don't think enough about the first of those effects that taxes have. We could raise all the revenue we need by taxing only activities that cause harm to others. Congestion, CO2, SO2, noise. The big ticket item, consumption taxes. Scrap the income tax. Instead, have people report their incomes to the tax authorities as they do now, but also their savings, as you would for a tax-exempt retirement account. And then your consumption for the year is your income minus your savings, and then take a big standard deduction, maybe 20,000 pounds a year for a family of 4, and that's what you pay tax on. Income minus savings minus 20,000 pounds. That's your taxable consumption. Have the rate start low, but then it's free to escalate almost without limit, according to how much revenue you think you can spend productively in the public sector fixing roads, bridges, and dams and water systems. The fear with the income tax is that if marginal rates get too high, people will stop saving and investing. But that's not a fear at all with a tax on consumption. A progressive consumption tax means you have more incentive to save and invest. So don't do it now. Wait till the economy's back on its feet. Better yet, phase it in now so people would see it, or enact it now and phase it in once we're back to full employment. Then people would see the tax coming and rush to put the wing on their mansion now before the tax was phased in. That would be massive economic stimulus without an extra penny on the government budget. It would also reassure the deficit worriers that we've taken steps, we're committed to steps that are going to bring in the revenue we need to get the deficit under control. So tax consumption. If you tax it, you create gold out of lead. A guy's thinking about putting a 2 million pound addition on his mansion. You put a very high tax at the margin on people who are spending that kind of money each year. He'll say, maybe I ought to scale back the addition I'm thinking of building. And others would respond similarly. They'd all build additions half as big, and then you'd discover, once the dust settled, that the additions half as big served just as well as the big ones would have, because it's relative mansion size that matters beyond some point. I think if I had a chance, I'd be willing to bet my retirement account that the rich would even be happier if they had smaller mansions. It's a pain to have a big mansion. Think about all the stuff you got to do. If the reason you need one is because people at your station are expected to have one, then acting collectively, this would be a reason to move to a country with this tax. You won't have to blow all your hard-won money on coming-of-age parties for your kids and mansions to entertain in. So that's the drill. I hope people will find my claim persuasive that Darwin really had a much more comprehensive view of the logic of competition than, I won't say than Smith did, because I'm sure if I combed through the Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments, I would be able to cobble together a story that's not so different from the one I'm telling here. But certainly a different vision from Smith's modern disciples. And I think if we can get clear on that, then we can sort of clear out a lot of the rhetoric that's preventing us from having a conversation about tax policy. We can't have that conversation. You can't talk about taxes in the U.S. You're drummed out of office if you propose any tax. Well, you have to tax something. Adults know that, and we need to remind people of that. If you have a country that can't tax, it doesn't have a government, it doesn't have an army. It gets invaded by a country that can tax, and then you pay tax to their government. So if you shout the slogans they're shouting, you're announcing to the world that you're not a serious person. You shouldn't want to do that. But nobody's calling them on it. They're shouting those slogans and they're getting away with it. And I don't know if the book will make any difference, but I feel better. I feel like I said my piece about why you're an idiot if you say slogans like that. So I'll turn it over to the commentators, and I hope there's time we can get some comments from the group.
Thanks, Bob. I kind of feel I'm the wrong person to be delivering this talk. What do you want in response to what Bob has just said? He's a proper thoroughgoing libertarian, someone who's driven up on the M40, on the right, of course, negotiating with every vehicle that might want to use the same carriageway. And since one drives a rather large Humvee, one has probably made a fair profit on the individual negotiations with each vehicle. I parked it out in outside Merton, and felt that my Second Amendment rights were being violated when they said I had to put the safety catch on the automatic rifle, which I wanted to bring into dinner this evening. The trouble, actually, as Bob has already identified, is that there are really not very many people in Europe who are willing to take that kind of position. And I guess that's why Princeton University Press couldn't find someone who was actually willing to disagree with Bob or not, without having to pay another airfare over the Atlantic. And that's why you're going to have to put up with me instead. So I thought I would not do the defense of libertarianism. What I thought I would do would be pick up what is emphatically the headline from Bob's book, the one that the publicists have put in all the releases about it, and that is the remark which he emphasized again in what he had to say to us today, which is that the future of Darwin, or of economics, lies with following Darwin, not with Smith, and in 50 years' time we'll all recognize that. Well, of course, this evolutionary perspective has been around economics for quite a long time. At the end of the last century, it was Alfred Marshall who was the great synthesizer of where economics was then.
Century before, John.
Sorry, at the end of the 19th?
You said last century.
Right, last century, I know. So some of us are still embedded in the 19th and 20th century, if not the 19th. At the end of the 19th century, Alfred Marshall, I knew him well. Old Alfred said to me, I think it's biology, not physics, that is the proper analogue for economics. And I think there was quite a deep point there. Back when I was a student of economics, slightly after Marshall, if I'm honest, back when I was a student of economics, like almost every student of economics, I was introduced to these welfare maximizing individuals and profit maximizing firms. And I said, as almost all students of economics do, well, isn't it? It's not quite like that, is it? And I was told, as all these beginning economics students are, yes, it is like that. And I remember the reason which was given to me, and the reason which actually I gave to students for a bit, was a kind of casual evolutionary argument. That I was told that firms maximize profits, individuals maximize their welfare, because if they didn't, they would lose out to firms and people who did, and therefore these would become the dominant mode of behavior. That was developed extensively at Chicago back in the 1950s, which really was a re-expression of a kind of social Darwinism that had been around in social sciences for some time. And as a casual argument, it is quite persuasive. But actually, the people who were generating that argument didn't understand evolution very well. In fact, I think when that argument was generated in economics, probably the mathematics of evolution was not understood as well as it is actually now. There's something in that argument, but not very much. Because what evolution is about reproductive fitness. And reproductive fitness is not quite the same as profitability. Indeed, I came across a very good illustration of that a couple of weeks ago when the chief financial officer of the Royal Bank of Scotland explained that people who were getting upset about universal banks and thought these large conglomerates should be broken up misunderstood that actually in the crisis of 2008, no universal banks had actually failed. And of course, in a sense, he was right. The argument is at one level absurd, but at another level, at the evolutionary level, it's very perceptive. Large universal banks like our Royal Bank of Scotland and UBS and Citigroup and so on may have failed commercially, but in terms of their capacity for reproductive fitness, they come out extremely well. Reproductive fitness and profitability, then, are not actually quite the same. In fact, the truth is, profitability is not the kind of characteristic which evolution is about. Profitability is an outcome of behavior, not a characteristic of behavior. One might say that the relevant characteristic is profit intention, not profitability, and I suppose RBS would have scored fairly well on that. The trouble is that doesn't really work because intention is an individual rather than an organizational characteristic. And where we have profitability as the intention of all the individuals in an organization, it turns out not to be something that is characterized by reproductive fitness. It actually turns out to be a cancer which eats the entire organization, as it did in Bear Stearns or Lehman, for example. And actually, the essential failure of these organizations was that they were populated entirely by individually greedy people who in the end destroyed the business of which they were part. So profitability isn't actually the characteristic for which selection exists. It's an outcome of behavior. And actually, if one's looking for characteristics that in some ways resemble the characteristics which we look for in evolutionary natural selection, we come to something like reputation, which has the properties of being perpetuating itself, being replicable and extendable, and is indeed the reason why organizations like Oxford University or Princeton University Press have actually been around for quite a long time. One can see in what I'm saying, I think, what an economics based on evolution might start to look like. And I think it's potentially a very interesting story. But it's not, however, what economists do, as most of you know. What economists do predominantly nowadays is rational choice modelling. And that looks similar in some ways to evolutionary arguments. Because the truth is the mathematics of optimization and the mathematics of the dynamic processes of fitness and evolution are quite similar to each other. They're not the same, but they are quite similar. So there's an affinity between these two kind of approaches. But the mathematics of rational choice is actually rather different, especially since, as I noticed when I was a beginning student, it's not quite like that when we say that firms maximize profits and individuals maximize their utility. Well, many of you will know that one of the booming fields of economics in the last decade has been behavioral economics, which says, well, we accept that in some respects it's not like that. But that's because people are stupid. They haven't done elementary economics courses, and if they had, they would have learned that this kind of behavior is inappropriate. But we acknowledge that, unfortunately, not everyone has done these courses, read these books, and therefore we have to modify our economics to take account of this stupid behavior. I think one of the interesting things about the evolutionary perspective is that one starts to ask whether, from an evolutionary point of view, that is so. The modern economic version of rational choice defines rational choice in terms of consistency. That is, the underpinning characteristic of rationality is that the rational individual behaves consistently. Now remember that evolution says that what matters is reproductive fitness. And now, is it the case that consistency is the main criteria of reproductive fitness? Have you ever heard people, have you watched the film in which someone says, darling, I love you. What I love you for is you are so consistent. I don't think so, somehow. I was reading in the papers this morning about some scientists at UCL who had published some work on the kind of neural pathways that lead to the widely observed in the behavioral economics literature tendency to excessive optimism. Now, excessive optimism doesn't score very well in terms of consistency and rationality, but perhaps it doesn't do so badly in terms of reproductive fitness. I can't imagine that I love you, darling, what I like is you're so consistent. But it's easier to imagine that I love you, darling, you're so positive about the world and everything that's going on in it. Can we talk about our future together? Perhaps optimism is what is being selected for, rather than the criteria of rational choice. At any rate, we need to think about these possibilities. And I think we need to think very seriously that the so-called mistakes which people are observed making in the behavioral economics literature are not, in fact, mistakes, but actually the kind of criteria which people are selected for. Let me give you one simple example, which is that one of these standard problems is so-called time inconsistency. As an example, if I ask you, would you like £100 now or £120 in a week's time, quite a lot of people will say, well, I'll have £100 now, thank you very much. One then poses the problem, would you rather have £100 in 52 weeks' time or £120 in 53 weeks' time? To which a lot of the same people who go for the £100 now say, well, in that case, I'll wait the 53rd week for the £120. Now, this is thought to be stupid. This is thought to demonstrate time inconsistency. Well, if it does, then it does. But I can tell you, faced with these options, I would take the £100 now. And the reason I would take the £100 now is that my experience of life says that problems are always more complicated than they seem. There's often a catch, and if there's a catch, it's more likely to emerge in the first week than it is in the 53rd week. And all in all, taking all of human experience together, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and I'd rather have the £100 now, thank you very much. What we're doing in these kind of experiments, actually, is creating highly artificial situations which are designed to elicit precisely the mistakes which appear to emerge from them. I think if we start to think in evolutionary terms, we realize that many of these supposedly irrational behaviors are actually characteristics which persist because they have served people well in a whole variety of practical situations they face in a complicated world. And the rule that says a bird in the hand is often worth two in the bush is one such rule. Let me end as one of the Scots in the room tonight by defending the Scot who was being attacked at the beginning. I think, as Bob has readily conceded, Adam Smith did not say many of the things, or did not believe many of the things which are attributed to him by his modern enthusiasts on the right. I can say this with a little bit of feeling, having been in just the last week attacked by the Adam Smith Institute, a representative of these kind of thinkers, for saying, you can't imagine that I might have said this, but I'm afraid I did, that the 2008 crisis had rather more to do with bankers than it did with government failures giving rise to it in the first place. This they thought was disingenuous. Well, perhaps it was disingenuous, but I'm afraid I stand by it. Actually, I'm pretty clear what old Adam himself would have thought of the modern investment banker. He didn't like very many people, actually, if you read what he actually said. And I'm very confident that the people I know in investment banks would not have been the kind of characters who would have appealed to him. I think we also need to recognise that Smith, like others in the Scottish Enlightenment of the time, were actually groping towards ideas of spontaneous order as something that exists within social organisation, which is relevant, I think, both to understanding the kind of theorems which were developed not really until the 20th century in economics, for understanding how it was that competitive markets reached some kind of equilibrium, and for understanding how it is that evolutionary processes lead to adaptation over time. It was, as is often the case, mostly there in that rather extended, convoluted work. But what I've tried to do this evening is to say how Darwin has, I think, a great deal to contribute to economics that has not yet been teased out. I don't think he will replace Smith as the attributed founder of the subject, but I think a synthesis of the kind of ideas that we learn from evolution and the kind of ideas which we derive from that kind of thinking is where the future of economic lies. And perhaps that'll be your next book, Bob.
I'd be
Thank
happy
you.
with that.
Well, it's a really very great honour to be asked to speak on this occasion. I must confess I'm feeling a little nervous because I'm only masquerading as an evolutionary biologist, and there are at least 3 real evolutionary biologists in the audience. Also, I know that these 3 real evolutionary biologists hate to be kept from their dinner and their drink, so I'm going to be really brief. So it's been a real pleasure to read the Darwin Economy. I don't have many libertarian friends, of course. However, I am subject quite regularly now to that kind of the same sort of inane dialogue. And I know that after reading this book, I will be far better armed when going into battle against those who find taxation, if not theft, as some sort of infringement of their civil liberties. Bob Frank uses very effective metaphors to clarify the relationships between individuals who contribute differently to a single economy. So the simplest metaphor, I suppose, is the family, where you can easily conceive of a situation where the 2 adults, or maybe more adults in it, where there's a large income differential between the adult members. And to expect all of them, or both of them, nuclear family, to contribute equally or even in proportion to their incomes would obviously be of no benefit to anyone in the family. That's very easy to see. Other obvious reasons, I suppose, that are articulated very nicely in this book for why the rich should pay taxes is that it was only possible for them to accrue such wealth by having the support of an infrastructure and consumer base that only a taxed economy can provide. Also, that luck plays a disproportionate role in the whole process, so that it's unlikely that you've actually worked that much harder than someone else to have made that much more money and therefore deserve to keep your hard-won gains. And I was also delighted to see that he says that there's very little empirical or apparently indeed theoretical evidence to support the oft-spouted concern that taxing the wealthy would disincentivize them to create further wealth. I was also pleased to read his negative analysis of the trickle-down effect, which I have always personally viewed with great suspicion. But there were some elements that were particularly eye-opening for me, some more subtle effects, such as the notion of actually paying within a society to maintain your rank, and I thought a very interesting exposition of the Coasian framework involving different people's willingness to pay that can lead to some of these equilibrium states, these competitive optima, if you like. So I'm certainly rapidly reconsidering my opinions about congestion charges, which I've always taken to kind of favour the rich and be unfair, not to mention the custom of certain airlines to offer money to people willing to give up their seats, which I've just fundamentally found unpleasant and, again, kind of unfair. Within this Coasian framework of thinking about how to create an efficient economy where everyone actually benefits within a hierarchical system, these things seem to make a lot of sense. So that's wonderful to me. It's always a great gift when a book changes how you think. And reading the Darwin Economy has been one such rare experience. Where I cannot entirely agree with Professor Frank is in his use of the Smith-Darwin conceit to frame these elegant and interesting ideas. However, I think I'm going to disagree even more with John Kay on this matter, because I do think that fundamentally, we do now accept that the dynamics of both evolutionary and economic systems are primarily driven by individuals acting, if you like, in their self-interest. This is no surprise when it comes to economic choice, but I mean, where Darwin's real insight was that there is also a long-term competitive advantage among animals when they possibly, well, almost inevitably, quite unwittingly, engage in such behaviors that could be interpreted as being selfish and that they permit them to leave behind more offspring than others. In Adam Smith's scheme, the desire to maximize personal profit is anything but inadvertent, and his insight, which has already been mentioned, is that such selfish behavior can somewhat paradoxically endogenously generate this kind of stable equilibrium, or perhaps unstable equilibrium, a competitive optimum, where everyone's interests are served as best as they possibly could be within the given constraints. But such equilibria also arise in evolutionary systems. This has also been mentioned, and certainly, and there's a long history now, which is why I'm uncomfortable about speaking here, because there's so many people who know it so much better than myself. But several interpreters of Darwin have, in various ways, pointed out how these processes can lead to equilibrium states. Certainly Fisher and Sewell Wright kind of visualized these as humps on some sort of fitness landscape. Perhaps the best or the most analogous kind of interpretation is that of an evolutionary stable state, which is articulated by Price and Maynard Smith, using game theory, of course, again, a tool that economists have used. I think the idea that these evolutionary ideas are completely distinct from economic ideas that John articulated rests on the notion that it is the language that's important rather than the narrative. I think the language of evolution, and of particularly the mathematics that's been so successfully applied to evolution, is probably not the best language to apply to economics. But I think the narrative as such of different equilibria arising, sort of being endogenously generated by these forces which shouldn't as such lead to these states, is well maintained both in economics and in evolution. So the realization of a competitive rather than absolute equilibrium state is an outcome that is common to economic and evolutionary systems. So where do I disagree then? I suppose where I disagree is the space that these different equilibria occupy. It's true that one thing that Darwin did anticipate, and where Professor Frank's analogy works extremely well, is the danger in these systems of descending into the territory of the grotesque. Alongside the possibility that a perfectly reasonable equilibrium will arise, exists the possibility that the competitors will become locked in an absurd and unproductive battle with unfortunate consequences for all. Runaway sexual selection is the example that Professor Frank uses here in his book to very good effect. And he's already described this process. This is where competition for mates leads to the evolution of these monstrous features. You think the modern bull elk was in trouble. You should see the antlers on the now extinct Irish elk. And these things are in and of themselves obviously of little use. So there are this possibility of the grotesque emerging within these systems is, I think, what Darwin seemed to very clearly understand and use and illustrate really with these ideas. I think the grotesque is a condition that threatens all social interaction, economic and otherwise. It arises within families, within relationships, within societies. We always live under the threat of the grotesque. And I think that's why the grotesque figures so strongly in fairy tales and indeed in literature, for example, in the genre of magic realism. I think it's because we live under the threat of the grotesque. And I think that's what Darwin identified very clearly, is that within this landscape, there is this one corner, this slippery slope, because I'm not even sure the grotesque is an equilibrium. It does get balanced often by the fact that the horns can't get too big. But we also know situations where the grotesque is not an equilibrium. It's just one slippery slope. Where it's a vortex. And I agree entirely that such grotesque outcomes are evident now in many aspects of our economy. And what I think that Bob Frank's been very convincingly and creatively arguing is how we can use the process of governmental intervention to steer away from the grotesque, to guard against it. I love the idea of progressive consumption tax, I think that would be a wonderful way to get those antlers sized down a bit. I do worry a little bit, though, if we sort of carry through with ideas of evolution, that if we impose a consumption tax, what if these rich people develop some other way of signaling that they are rich? I mean, it would be fine because it still mean that this egregious consumption would be curtailed. But how would we get our taxes? So there are some worries I have about the application of these ideas. So just to say, in my final analysis, well, what I'm going to say is actually also, again, you've taken away my punchline by saying that if you comb through the Wealth of Nations, you'll probably say that Adam Smith had already thought of this. But what I was going to say is that I'm not sure these proposals to steer us away from the grotesque outcome don't in fact lead just towards, well, really the kind of equilibrium that Adam Smith envisaged. I think some notions, some of these ideas of cozy and efficiency in particular, and of course I'm not an expert here, but to me they seem kind of quite close to the ideal of sort of invisible hand equilibrium. And in fact, it's also not entirely clear to me that this willingness to pay framework might not itself lead to some grotesque outcome. If the gap is too large between what one person is willing to pay and another person is willing to pay, that too, I think, has a danger of leading to that grotesque outcome and take us away from the fair and deliberate exchange that Smith perceives as necessary for the establishment of his ideal state. So just to end by saying, are we not really relying at this point on government intervention to guide us towards a situation as envisaged by Smith, where we do not rely on the benevolence of tradesmen and manufacturers and who knows whoever, charities for meeting our material needs, but, as Emma Rothschild puts it, on our relationship to them as more or less equal participants in a rhetorical cognitive exchange. Thank you very much.